Well, welcome to the conversation. I want to spend our time talking a little bit about the art of sermon planning. How do we develop an ongoing rhythm that honestly is a healthy rhythm when it comes to our sermon development? Over the years, even if you're a gifted communicator, you love standing up and preaching on a regular basis, it can take its toll. It can become more challenging to create what I would dub innovative content so that you keep your audience engaged. And that ongoing just push and drive year after year, month after month can become wearisome as a lead communicator. So I'm going to take a little bit of time. Let's talk about that. And I'm going to share in that process some principles, some ideas that I've learned along the way that have helped me. And I want to pass them on to you as well. The first thing is simply this: you've got to be a student. I'm going to encourage all of you to really be a learner and understand the flow and the rhythms that exist in your community. Whether or not you are a rural community, whether or not you're in an urban community here in the US, every community of people has its specific rhythms to the way that it operates. In other words, why do people do what they do, but specifically also, why do they do what they do when they choose to do it? I found that most of Americans tend to think through their pace of life and their commitments based on the school calendar more than they do the yearly calendar. And so you want to pay attention to little things like, when does school get back in session? Where are the major breaks that exist for the school district? When does the school let out and summer break actually begins? And the more that you can kind of sync with what's going on in the way that people think about their daily life and their daily rhythms, you will actually be able to connect and create greater momentum in that process. And so be a student, understand the overall flow and the rhythms of your community. For instance, how this began to play out. I've noticed that this at least was true in the two communities that I've led local churches, both in Arizona and here in Florida, that early on in the school year, so right as school's kind of getting back in session, I found that the people that tend to show up to church in that season are people that really have very little church experience or background. And my leism, why I think they tend to show up in the local church, is probably because their kids are back into school. They're trying to navigate new family rhythms. There's probably a little bit of tension in the home. Kids may have befriended the wrong crowd, or they've gotten in trouble in school or at home. And the parents kind of think, well, if I could just get them into church, the church is going to straighten them out. And so they tend to check out the local church to see if this could be a helpful thing to the parenting dynamics of what's taking place in their home. The second major rhythm I found where new people tend to drop in the life of our church was in January, right after kind of that year where people are making yearly goals and resolutions. And typically those people are people that have some type of previous church experience, some type of previous church background. Maybe it's as far back as when they were children, or maybe it was a decade ago, but they tend to walk back in the doors of the church recognizing, you know what, I just haven't been as committed to this as I probably should. I think it's time for me to get back into church. And so if you know those things and know that those tend to be two major momentum moments in the life of the local church, I'm going to encourage you to gear your sermon series around that. I found that early in the fall that we would really kind of focus in on relationship cues and relationship goals. So we maybe do a marriage series or a parenting series or a friendship series, knowing that that was the kind of the heightened thing that people were walking in the doors of the church looking for. And then in the new year, knowing that these tend to be people that kind of have some type of previous church experience or background, I would do something that had some type of appeal to them, or some type of, yeah, I remember that guy. And so I do either a character study or a specific book of the Bible that I knew that they would have some type of familiarity with, and that in itself would pique its interest. For instance, we did one January, we came out of January and we did Jonah. Knowing that if you had any type of previous church experience somewhere, you knew something, there was some level of comfortability with the person of Jonah in that story, and they were more likely to maybe dive in and key off of what was kind of going on in that process. The second principle I want to encourage you to do is I'm going to encourage you all to plan at least 6 months out. 1 year really is ideal. And if you begin to plan out with that kind of diligence and future thinking, it really opens up the door for you to have greater margin on your week to week basis of how you lead the local church. At the same time, it creates margin for you to be more creative and innovative in your preaching and even in your overall sermon and weekend development. I've always worked off of kind of the 1 year mentality, planning way out in advance. And specifically what rhythm has worked for me is I take about a week off and just do a sermon series kind of retreat planning time period, where I'll get away from kind of the normal rhythm, spend time in prayer, spend time reading, and begin to map out kind of key conversations that I believe that we need to have. And by the time that I'm done with that, I have a very detailed rough draft of kind of how I feel like we need to approach the year, what conversations we need to have as a church, what God is doing in our church specifically, in the conversations he's asking us to have, and at the same time planning out when, how we're going to do that, and then being able to also incorporate when are we going to do communion, when are we going to do baptisms, and making sure that there's a just nice natural flow and rhythm to the way that all those things correlate. In that process, I work as well to kind of think through and pray through what is a major theme that I feel like God wants us to just focus on for the next year. I actually ask our key pastors and our elders of our church to spend some time in thinking through and praying through that. And we get together and we really work to come up with one specific word that will actually help us center all the conversations that we're going to have as we move forward in these specific conversations as a church. And honestly, having that theme really is helpful when it comes to the overall sermon development as well. Some key series that you want to think through and plan to put a part of your regular preaching calendar. One is you need to take time to really articulate vision. Vision correlates with our mission. And you might kind of go, well, how do those two things flow together? And partly, I think there's a level of fuzziness that exists because sometimes we use those words interchangeably, but they are different. I would classify it this way, that mission is more about the compass. It gives us direction. This is where we are headed as a local church. Vision is more the travel brochure of what is it actually going to look like when we get there. And so 2 times a year that I really think are great times of the year to add vision conversations to the mix. One is in January when everybody's kind of getting back into that normal rhythm. And in January with that, way that I play that out is specifically we have a state of the church address, and where it's just one specific Sunday that I dive deeply into what were all the things that God did over this past year. And these are kind of big yay God moments. We'll talk about the finances. We'll talk about life change. We'll talk about baptisms. We'll talk about all the holistic components of our vision as a church. And we'll celebrate what God has done. And then I'll lay out, this is what we believe that God is calling us to be about this coming year. And in that, giving them that travel brochure, this is what it's going to look like when we get through this. I ask at the end of that, would you join us? And this is what it means to join us. And that vision, we find it just really helps our church come together and gel well. The second time I love to really talk about vision is right before school gets back into session. This is a great time to remind people about this is why we exist. This is why we do the things that we do. Would you get involved as we move into the fall, knowing that we're going to have an influx of new families, new people looking for answers, looking for truth. And we really would love to have you join us in that process and be on mission with us. And so articulating that vision, and usually I'll take a couple more weeks during the summer to kind of put all that conversation together. But that's been a good rhythm for me in that process. The second thing is you want to take time to preach and teach on generosity. Why? It comes back to we have a give first God. We need to be a give first people. That, in other words, we have and serve and are loved by a very generous God. And if we call ourselves followers of him, we need to live generously as well. And this is one of those things you want to trickle in regularly into the heartbeat of your church. You should at least have a generous kind of conversation about generosity, even if it's a 30-second component that you put in the weekend every other week or so. But then you want to take 3 or 4 weeks out of the year to actually just train and teach your people about what generous living actually looks like. I found for me that it works really, really well to do that sometime in the fall, late October, early November. That really helps set up kind of end of the year giving conversations as well, asking people, hey, as you come to the end of the year, if you're looking at making a final donation, either as a business or as an individual for tax purposes, we would love if you consider giving towards our ministry here, our church in that process. So it's again about how do we connect all the dots in the process. You want to do some type of series, basics of discipleship, reminding people, what does it mean to just simply be a follower of Jesus? What are disciplines that we need to encourage, include in our lives? And summer is a great time to do kind of the basics of discipleship. And the reason I like summer is people are out of rhythm when it comes to just their normal life walk. In other words, they're taking time to do vacation. They're taking time to get away with family. And so the idea is you don't want to have a sermon series that fundamentally really connects to the previous week. In other words, like if you missed last week, this week's probably not going to make sense. And so these are kind of one-off weekends, but they have a general theme that corrals them together. And so summer is a great time to do that. I'm going to encourage you as well, take some time to talk about biblical community, why community matters, why we need to be committed to biblical community, and then incorporate some time of the year kind of the core values of the church. Right now, we are literally, when I'm recording this, we are in the process of doing kind of the combination of vision conversation with our core values. Instead of just taking a 2-week kind of conversation on vision, we're actually taking 5 weeks to incorporate and talk about our values and how our values help build towards the vision of what we believe God is calling us to be about as a local church. The next principle, and this may be kind of a dumb moment, but I do want to say it, is purposely plan out your vacations around the big weekends. In other words, you don't want to take, if you're the main communicator of your church, you don't want to take Easter weekend off. Think about when are the low attendance weekends throughout the year. Those are the weeks, those are the weekends that you want to miss. And I would say too, a healthy rhythm is at least once a year, Pastor. You need to plan a vacation or time to be out of the pulpit a minimum of 2 weeks in a row. That way you actually have time to mentally and emotionally come down. Otherwise, you're going to be working even while you're on vacation because you've got to deliver a sermon that next week. And so I want to encourage you to at least take once a year, you need to have 2 weekends off in a row to help maintain kind of that healthy rhythm of what and the energy that it zaps out of you when you on a regular trajectory of preaching on a regular basis. Next, find and ride the wave of momentum. Every year, there are natural components that help us create momentum. I shared 2 of those already, one being the back to school push and then the kind of the New Year push. But moving into Christmas oftentimes is a momentum season, and then lastly, coming out of Easter. And so if you know those are natural momentum, pay attention to those, build upon those, do everything you can to keep the momentum moving forward. Momentum is a lot like an elephant. You don't ever want to let it sit down because the moment that it sits down, it's really, really hard to get it up and moving again. And so think about, let's take Easter, for instance. Easter itself will naturally create momentum. You don't need to do a real fancy, creative series and launch it on Easter. People will show up to Easter just because it's Easter. So let me encourage you, just preach the resurrection of Jesus. Focus on that. Start the next series the week after or 2 weeks after Easter and give people a reason to come back and be a part of it. A great way to even do that is maybe bring in a personality from time to time. I brought in professional sports people. I've brought in community leaders. None of those have actually ever cost me anything, but they just have an incredible testimony. Don't give them the mic and just give them the stage. Interview them. And the reason why I encourage you to think about interviewing them is that personality will not be back the following week, but you will. And you want the people that are new in the community, new to your church, connect with you so that you can build trust with them to begin to speak the truths of the gospel into their lives. But you want to pay attention. How do we maintain momentum? How do we create one bump? Let's say Easter is a bump, and then create another bump right after that. And as a result, you'll never quite drop as low as you were before. Lastly, I want to encourage you, think through and plan accordingly. What questions are people actually asking? I believe that churches are notorious at focusing in on and trying to answer questions that I honestly believe people aren't actually asking. And so how do we make sure that we are in tune and being relevant in the way that we communicate and what we communicate about? First of all, you need to have non-Christian friends. That in itself will naturally put your mindset thinking about how would they receive this? How would I communicate this truth to them? The second thing I want to encourage you to think about is poll your audience once or twice a year. For instance, you have all these new people that maybe show up once a year on Easter weekend. Maybe take 30 seconds at the beginning of your sermon or at the end of the service, say, hey, we love your help. We are a church about our community. We would love to know what are some ideas, what are some topics that you just wish the local church would have a conversation about? And ask them to just write down that answer. Maybe they text it in. But you could easily get 2 years of sermon content just based off of that quick poll. And so focus in again on what questions are people actually asking in that process. Now, I want to take you to another resource. And this is kind of the way that we specifically internally calendar. We created a Google Doc, and we share this with all kind of the key personnel that help the weekend be the weekend. So other communicators, our production team, our worship experience, all of they have the ability to assess this and to even contribute in the process. In that, you'll find that all the different color codes that you see on there actually represent different series. So it's easy to quickly recognize, okay, this is the series that we're doing at this time of the year. You'll notice on the one side, again, the font's a little small, but on the one side, we have the dates. We have any major weekends that or anything that's kind of coordinated. If it's a Father's Day weekend or a Mother's Day weekend or a Christmas weekend, we put that in there. We will also label each series an A series, a B series, or a C series. And let me kind of walk you through what that code means. So an A series is we will only do 4 A-level series a year. And those are all in. No key leaders, no staff are allowed to take those series off for vacation unless it's a family emergency. So we want all hands on deck. We're going to go all in, meaning we're going to market outside. We're going to advertise. We're going to talk about it with our people way ahead of time, getting them praying, getting them thinking about how to invest and invite their friends and their family to be a part of that series. A B level series, because you can't maintain that high level production each and every week, each and every series, because sometimes we'll get ourselves into this trap of going, well, I got to outdo the last series. And the last series was phenomenal. You can't maintain, that's not a sustainable pace. So B series, we dial back a little bit. It's just internal marketing. We focus on, again, getting key resources in the hands of the people of our church. We help them have conversations, but we're just doing mainly internal marketing in that process. We're not going high video production on those type of series. C series is just low maintenance. It's just more about the internal conversation that we're having. So we do no marketing at all, no major push on the C series. And that becomes a natural, healthy rhythm in the life of our church. It makes it easier to understand. In this, we put in series descriptions. We'll talk about the message title. We are a church right now that exists 3 different congregations in 2 different locations and in 2 different languages. And so in that process, we will even communicate who is speaking where on which weekend, what topic needs to be covered. Do we need to tweak something for that congregation versus this congregation? We will create a message description that if we are doing some type of marketing and advertising, the advertisers can pull from that to help put those components together. And then in the end, we put down, like, is this a communion weekend, a baptism weekend? What conversation needs to be had according to that? We put in who's going to be the host for that weekend, and then what is the major takeaway? And we try to clarify that to one thing. What is the one major takeaway that we hope people get on the other side of this conversation this week and of the series? Again, it's not rocket science, but it's just the deliberate, specific focusing in on how do we communicate in a clear manner and get everybody working on the same page. And so it really, really helps create more margin. It will help your life as a communicator as well.